Warm and cool in watercolor painting. Why is it important? And how do you avoid muddy paintings? Understanding how warm colors, cool colors interact with each other will enable you to create paintings with more of a balance and harmony and avoid those common problems in watercolor like muddy paintings. Hello, I'm Tim Wilmot, a watercolor painter. I produce full-length video tutorials with commentary, which will help you improve your watercolor techniques and create some hopefully great looking paintings. So in this video, I'll talk about colors in more detail and tips on how to avoid muddiness in your watercolor. Have you heard, well, you probably have heard of the color wheel. If not, look it up on the web. There's lots of material out there and theories on how these colors interact with each other. So what are warm colors? What are cool colors? If you divide the complete color spectrum in half, you will roughly get warm colors on one side and cool on the other. So warm colors are, of course, yellow, orange, red. Cool colors are blue, green, and violets. The theory is that if you combine complementary colors, so colors that are on opposite sides of this wheel, so look it up on the web, these wheels, and look at the color. Just choose a color, then go to the opposite side, and they are theoretically complementary colors, and they look good up against each other. So warms give you a nice intimate feeling. You're warm, you're comfortable. Cool colors are soothing. Think of ice, soothing, cooling, calming. And the principle is not just within the realms of painting. One of my other passions is gardening. And gardeners, when they're planting a flower garden, they go for color combinations that are complementary and not those that not putting together two colors that are hard on the eye, that jar up against each other. And also interior design, I've heard it there. Different ideas about what color do you paint your bedroom. Well, you try to keep on the cool side, maybe a bluish color rather than a reddish color. So anyway, back to painting. Two more things. There are what we could call neutral colors or near neutral, like brown, for example. Brown is mostly warm, but it could appear cooler up against a blue, for example, because it's sort of near that cooler spectrum. And black and white, well, they're obviously neutral. They're not warm or cool, but they would go alongside. Think about how they would go alongside any other color. They're just going to work. You don't need to think about it. And lastly, I concentrate a lot on edges in watercolor. So the dividing line, so when we're talking about these warm and cool colors, the dividing line between the warm color and the cool color, is it a hard edge or is it a soft edge? Anyway, so this is my source photo for the painting. This is again Aimé in southwest France, but it could be anywhere that's in a slightly warmer climate or a warmer time of year, and the lovely warm buildings. I mean, in the Mediterranean, terracotta buildings, terracotta tiles on the rooftops. So look at the cool sky, these warmer buildings, the coolness of the shadows here as well. So we've got cool, warm, cool, well, maybe a little bit of warmth in the street, but certainly the cool shadows, a coolish car, warm buildings on the left hand side. That's what we're going to concentrate on this painting. But also in watercolor, we're thinking about lights and darks, so different range of values. So for example, we're nice and dark at the bottom of this building, a nice little bit of light hitting the side of this building. We can play on that. Of course, the light coming across the scene here. The light's in the top left corner, coming down, Nice bit of light there. Bit of reflection on the window of the car. From a composition point of view, we have, well, there's this figure walking away, but we'll have the figure walking into the scene. I don't want a figure right on the right hand side walking away from the scene. I want the figure to be more in the middle, so walking into the scene. These cars, I need to be a bit careful on the right hand side. Don't want to have too much detail on the right hand side. Lovely old lamp here above the street, attached to this wall. That'd be a nice little thing to include. So yes, think about composition, lights and darks, warms and cools, edges. That's what we're going to be thinking about. So let's see how we get on. The paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford cold press, 300 grams, so it's a medium kind of weight, medium texture. And first step, do the outline drawing. So I'm using a soft pencil here. This is a 3B pencil, and the idea is just to get the main shapes. So, and I'm consciously thinking about what the end painting is going to look like. I'm thinking about composition. I'm also trying to think about how to simplify the scene. There's lots of little architectural details that could make for a complex painting, and the danger is if I concentrate on all those details, then we don't end up with a fresh or loose looking painting. A lot of people, when they get into watercolors, they want to try and paint in a loose style, a relaxed style. So as I'm doing here with these windows, just a squiggle, just to indicate where I think they're going to be. The end of the street there, looking into the distance between the gap between the left building and the building that's the buildings on the right hand side. Just trying to think of that as a shape. We don't want to put too much detail, certainly into anything in the background or around the edges of the painting. Now, pretty important in the composition is that car, which I think looks quite nice to have in the scene. And a lot of people avoid putting cars into their street scenes and urban landscapes. So try and include cars. It's a very simple shape. This one is cars are a lot easier to draw when you're looking at them from the front or the back. Try and avoid a side view. A lot more difficult to get right with the proportions and the wheels and so on. So that car just have some rectangles, basically, very easy to do. Simplification of the left hand side, just a few arches, not concentrating with any of the detail in the upper levels of that building. The figure, so I've included the figure to balance the car, so they're almost there's these principles of thirds in painting and composition and photography and so on. So I've got the figures on the right hand third, the cars on the left hand third. Hopefully that should work. Cars on the right, don't want to include too much of them. Yes, they're there, so just an indication of the backs of those cars, backs of the few cars, just to, as I say, indicate that there are some parked cars there, and there's sort of an open square over to the right hand side. Now, perspective is very important in this, particularly on the left hand side. That building, very steep angle at the top, almost 45. Think of these angles, that street level line going from bottom left up to the car. It's almost a 45-degree line, isn't it? So think of it as an angle, as an angle in degrees, or maybe the shorthand on a clock. That's sort of 1:30, so to speak, going up from bottom left to top right. So first step done, initial drawing. Second step, get in the wash, initial wash, and I'm going for a cool sky. So I'm mostly using here a combination of cerulean blue and cobalt blue. With a big mop brush, this is a Raphael mop brush, and coming down over the skies, so over the rooftops, so that I can get a soft edge with the warmer colors now. So that this is the first time where I'm thinking about those colors. So I've come over the rooftops now with a slightly thicker consistency of paint. So the sky was a little bit more watery. This now is a bit thicker, and we're going up back into the roof, joining the sky. There is a slight slope on this board. The colors will intermingle a little bit, but this will give us that soft edge. So pretty much I'm just choosing this warmer color, a light red, bit of yellow ochre. And it's important with these larger areas to keep mixing in different colors, different hues. Otherwise you'll end up with a more boring appearance to it all. So as I'm moving over these larger areas, I'm introducing in different colors. Now painting around important objects like that car, it's going to be a light car against a darker background. So I want to paint around that. Likewise the figure. Carefully paint around that one as well. Before everything dries, I can still be working up towards the top. There's the chimney. Now it was just a little bit too wet there, so I had to mop up a little bit, otherwise it could have bled a little bit too much into the sky. So needs a bit of careful watching when I'm going up into the sky like that. So coming down towards the street now, cooler color. But the warmth of the building, some of that wash is coming down into the street there. But essentially I'm going to try and keep that slightly cooler than the buildings. This area here is in the shade, so I'm going to be cool, blue, predominantly. I will be, of course, going over the top of this. This is just the base color. We're just aiming to cover most of the paper except for the bits that are going to be very light, or that I want to maybe put a little bit more detail into. So we let that now dry, excuse me, dry, and we'll then be able to go on to the next stage. So next step after that initial wash, and I've let everything dry 100%, I have speeded up this video. I used a hairdryer just to speed things along. So things are dried a little bit lighter. In watercolor, sometimes go in a lot stronger with the colors and values that you think, because it will generally dry a lot lighter. But the third stage now is to go in with some darker values for these shadows, but I don't want to add in necessarily a cool color on top of the warm color to counteract what I've done already. So a nice dark value to start with with that bottom, that middle building there. Should point out my palette to you. Starting from the top, neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue and cobalt blue, they're in the middle there, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson. See, alizarin crimson, that's like a cool red. It's a bit like a red with a bit of blue in it, so it is a much cooler red. And going on further down, we've got a bright red, so warmer colours to finish off with. Bright red, which is, I think it's a Windsor red. And then I've got a light red, great for these sorts of buildings and terracotta rooftops. Then I've got cadmium orange and cadmium yellow. So the first wash, as regards brushes, the first wash was done with a larger mop brush. I'm using Raphael Soft Aqua brushes. They're synthetic brushes, but they've got the feeling of a natural hairbrush. Now this one is a size 4 brush, so it's a medium thickness. And generally as I go through the painting, I will be going down. As I go through each stage, I go down in size as regards the brushes. Thinking about values. So this building I've just done, fairly light at the top, darker down towards the bottom. And look at the contrast at the moment between the car and that building. A little bit too much, the car is too bright. But hopefully you see what I mean. That car immediately looks brighter with the darker background. I'm going to mute it down a bit, but you get the idea. So replicating this now, going on and doing the building on the right hand side. I am mixing just a little bit of blue here and there into the building, but predominantly I'm trying to keep it as warm as possible. And as I explained, using these combination of colours, alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, light red. If you want to go really hot, you could use a bright red as well. And as I come down to the base of the building, I can go a little bit cooler, but also of course I'm going to get a lot darker, more intense, a thicker color there. So that's why I've gone up with the neutral tint. And that neutral tint, that can be made warm or cool by the addition of ultramarine blue to make it cool, or a red to make it warm, or a burnt sienna. So that can go either way. So values again coming up to this figure and down to the street level. We've got a good contrast in values and edges. Look at the fairly hard edge going, the shadow going across the street. Compare that with the softer edge that we had, or that I had at the top of the rooftops. with the sky. Now this brush, try and have a brush that's got a good edge to it, because then you can make for some harder edges, got a more precise control as well. So try and get a brush that's got a good point and a good edge, so when you flatten it out, it's got a nice, almost like a butter knife edge to it. Left hand building, I'm going to start dark towards the top. Quite a thick mixture here, and you can see the effect that I've got there, a bit of a ragged edge to this, and another edge. So we've got soft edge, hard edges, and then this sort of ragged edge, but quite dark and thick. But then as I come down, add a bit more water into the mixture, so it's not so intense. But still predominantly keeping it warm. Light red, yellow ochre, but these different combinations as I come down, as I did do. So also I've left a few gaps here and there, doesn't really matter, it just adds to a bit of the freshness to it. And sometimes these little areas that I've left unpainted, you can make them into something that could be the top of a lamp, or lower down it could be another figure that you could introduce, maybe some light just catching the top of someone's head or their shoulders. You can make different things of them. Like the building on the right hand side, go a little bit darker towards the bottom to the street. And then with these shadows, we're now going cool. So we've got the cool compared with the warmth at the top, on the side of the building. Nice and cool. And as with the building, I'm adding in different colors into these shadows, so they are a little bit more interesting. Connecting up with the figure as well. Which is another important element of the composition, is trying to connect these different objects together so they're not too isolated and standing out on their own. So the car is connected with its surroundings, the figure is connecting the foreground with the middle ground. We could have done the same with a lamppost or a street sign or something like that, some sort of vertical object going up and down, connecting these different elements, or it could be horizontal. So I'm thinking about strong verticals in the overall composition. Now I'm toning down that white car a little bit. Of course, it's in the shade, it's not totally white, so I need to go in with a fairly weak wash here with this same brush. And the shadows, the shade, the shadows going across the street, they're still damp, moist. I can blend in that car with the shadows going across the road. Let's have this figure fairly light, not as dark as the background, with this sort of bluish color, and meet with the shadows just to connect them all together. Arms, of course, connecting with the building behind. So this little, that lovely light in the gap there, painting the main elements there. I could have done that with a smaller brush actually, but I had that brush to hand. So I've got a slightly smaller brush now and not too much water. So we're going to be using some dry brush strokes. And I just put a few marks across the ridge of the roof just to indicate that you know there is a roof there, and there's maybe some objects on the top of the roof or something behind it. Very briefly describe the windows and those timbers going across the building. Some lovely buildings in this part of France. They're very beautiful with the older buildings with these timbers are over the front, horizontals, diagonals, verticals. So for these dry brush marks, I'm using predominantly darker colours and, as I say, very little water. So I'm just basically dabbing between I'm just picking up colour from the burnt sienna, burnt umber, neutral tint, but it could be anything dark really. At this stage you don't need to think too much about warm and cool with these little architectural details. So there's some shutters. Just pick up a cobalt or a cerulean blue for those, just to give the impression of some shutters in that building. Now while the paint is still moist, I can be lifting off some of the colour to show a bit more of the wash or the paper below, just to make it a little bit lighter. Don't overdo it, and don't do it too much, otherwise, depending on the paper you're using, you could damage the surface of the paper. So as I say, don't do it too much. But while the timing is of the essence in watercolor, while it's still moist and damp, you can still be lifting things off or adding more colors to it. If you're adding more color to an already damp surface, it generally needs to be a bit thicker in consistency than the paint below, what you're painting into. Windows, I'm not drawing not painting every single pane in the window, but just the overall impression of the window there. Need to be fairly careful with these horizontals. and introduce a little bit of what we call lost and found. So it's sometimes not a complete line going across. I'm pressing down harder and then lifting off as I'm making these lines. So I have little faint gaps, little indiscrete gaps in that line. And again, there's just a few little gaps there, do you see, in that vertical coming down. This really, adding in these marks now, this starts to make the building look a little bit more realistic, more sort of medieval in appearance. And I don't need to copy exactly where these lines are. I'm just giving the impression of those diagonals and verticals and horizontals, just to give the impression of these old timbers. But it's very important to use these dry brush strokes in rendering these, in making these lines. Lower down, I can use more of the neutral tint to get a darker value. So going down into the cooler bottom of this building. So it's still fairly warm at the top, cool down towards the bottom, and then darker, thinking about values, darker elements, these doorways and shop windows or archways. Use the finger just to smudge things and introduce different effects to the edges. So here I'm going right up against this figure for a little bit of contrast. You see it makes that face stand out a little bit more, but not a complete frame around the head. As it make it look a little bit, or it won't be too natural looking. So now for some darker lines on the left-hand building. the windscreen of the car. So I'm not going to go totally over to the right hand side, but just have a slightly darker left hand side. Maybe it's the reflection of the sign above or the darker values above. And then the shadow underneath the car. And just use the finger a bit just to get that softer edge. Cars on the right hand side, not too much detail, but I will just give them a bit of a shadow underneath. Now a few more details on the left hand side. These arches, so I had these 3 arches, quite dark at the top, and then a lot softer as I come down. So a hard edge at the top, softer edge as I come down. Think about perspective as well. Need to just add in a few darker lines to help with the perspective and the bottom of that building, just to lead the eyes, a little bit more. Some darker lines in that shady area up to the car, and a little bit of lost and found, not a complete continuous line. Alternate the thickness of the line, and a little bit of darkness against the car as well. Just checking the edge on my brush. Maybe sneak in another arch here on the left. I think it needs it. There was a bit of a space there, so just sneak in a 4th archway. Again, it's just fairly dry brush strokes there, not too wet at all. Maybe just a few, because I've got quite a good edge on this brush. I can now create some quite precise lines for the some lines going across the square. I could have made these timbers, I could have used a smaller round brush for this, but I've still got this mop brush. It's doing all right. And you can see it's got quite a good retention of water. I don't have to keep adding in more water. I can keep painting with it for quite a long time because it is capable of holding a lot of moisture. Now the tiles on the rooftop, of course I'm not doing every single tile, but I just want to put in a few little marks there to give the impression of those tiles, but not, of course I'm not painting every single tile. And just a few more lines on going over to the right hand side, because the sun's coming from the left. I want that to be brighter, and then we can see more tiles as I go away from the sun. So at this stage of the painting, I'm just adding in a few details to different objects, but being conscious not to overdo things. The critical thing is knowing when to stop in watercolor, and I often make the mistake of going on too much, overdoing things, so that the painting looks overworked. You then tend to lose the freshness and the looseness that you had initially when you started, because you've just gone in too much. Just want to try and stop and put the brakes on and not do too many details. I need a bit more darkness in there. Do you see against that car, the corner of that car? That just looks a little bit better. Gives the impression of it's sort of nestling up against the wall, and we've got a nice bit of dark shadow against, nice contrast between the dark value of that shadow and the light of the car. Add a bit more color, or add a bit of a darker value to the legs of this figure and the head. I'll add some more details to those cars as well, not too much. So I'm using just very light, just very brief strokes there to, again, dry brush strokes, to just create more of the impression of the windscreens and so on, and a bit of red for the tail lights of the brake lights of those cars. I'm going down to a smaller brush now. So this is my small synthetic round brush. And really this is some of the final stages of the painting. Just check the edge. I've got a nice sharp edge. a few window panes there. Just going around the painting, adding in a few brush marks here and there. Mostly dry brush, not too much water. Try and emphasize some edges. Down into the cooler base of that building. Bit more of a definition to the bottom of that car. Harder edge, deeper shadow to the tops of these arches. Few horizontals just to show that there's some building blocks there, or bricks. Now that line there just helps balance the line I had at street level and just gives a bit more of an idea of the perspective of the scene. Perhaps just a few horizontals at the tops of the rooftops to indicate some aerials or something like that. A bit more definition to the street light. That's it. And we're done. So here is the finished scene. In this video I've been talking about warms and cools, why it's important, and thinking about the edges as well. So going back to warm and cool, cool sky, warm building, cooler at the base of the buildings, cooler foreground, certainly cool in the shadows here as well. So thinking about the colour wheel, but don't get too hung up about colours. Now, I did say about avoiding muddiness in watercolour, and that can be achieved, I believe, by thinking about those complementary colours and not trying to mix up too many colours. Try and also, how many colours have you got in your palette? I often see people, particularly those people starting off, beginners with watercolour beginners, thinking about, oh, I must have all the sorts of different colours to cover every kind of colour combination scenario. So I have about 6 different greens and 4 different yellows and so on. The danger is that you've got too much to think about, and you will end up with, by, you know, if you were, say, applying, you had a yellow and then you had a red and then you had a green. When you combine all those together, you could end up with muddy colours. Also, try and get as good a quality brand as you can with paints. So there are some better quality artist quality paints or professional quality paints. Try and avoid those that might say they're students or unless they say artist quality or professional quality, they're the best ones to go for, to try and avoid that muddiness. But try and restrict your palette. Try and get down to, say, 6 or 7 colors, or even 3 or 4. I've often I've done a few videos with a very restricted palette, and it works. You get a really nice fresh feeling. You avoid those muddy colors. Give it a try. Just try and do a painting, just say with the primary colors, yellow, red and blue, and then maybe introduce some secondary colors to see how you get on. But anyway, warms and cools, thinking about the edges as well. Soft edge here on the rooftop, harder edges down the sides, hard edge there, do you see? Harder edges, and then a bit of a soft approach to some of these shadows as well. So hopefully you like that video. Hopefully it's a good little introduction into warms and cools. By the way, if you like these videos, please join my little community up on the Patreon system. I've got a site on Patreon, www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TIMWILMOT. Every month or two, I set a painting project for my members, and for a small pledge, I give you a personal critique. This is normally, I do a short little video, send it back to you, send a link back to you via email with some extra hints and tips. So for more details, please go to my Patreon site. It may help you improve your watercolor, and you'll be joining a community where you can share your paintings and get some feedback from like-minded watercolor painters. Also, please, if you've got any questions about this video, pop in your questions or comments below. Also, please subscribe to get automatic notification of future videos. But thanks very much for watching. Hopefully it was a good introduction into the importance of warms and cools in watercolor painting. And for more of my paintings, you'll see lots more examples of warms and cools up on my website, www.timwilmot.com. Thanks for watching. Catch up with you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.